Okay, in this very brief presentation, I just want to go over the midterm grade and provide some feedback. I will likely provide some additional feedback at another time to get a little bit deeper into the answers and to help you kind of see where you're at in the process. Um, Most students at this point in the class on this midterm are kind of in the 2 to 3 range. So they're kind of going from a C minus to a B. And that's very consistent over the last 10 years because this is a very new concept to most of you. And in some ways, uh, some of the things that you've learned in previous classes aren't particularly helpful because they're not based in law. They're based in more of the law enforcement or corrections or some of the more idealized misconceptions. Um, so this class is really meant to kind of fill in some of those gaps and to help you see the more complicated and dynamic aspects of the law. Um, the other thing I want to mention here is that one of the reasons I like teaching at community college as opposed to the 4 year or law school is because I want what would be called ordinary folk, non-lawyers, to understand how the law functions and works better. So try to understand that it is my goal for you to improve in this class, and I will give you as many opportunities as possible to do that. But you will have to look at this class quite a bit differently than you would your other classes. Now, the baseline that you have to start with is to understand that when you came into this class, and to be honest, right, if you were anything like me, when I first went into a criminal justice or a pre-law class, much of what I thought about law came from TV, movies, songs, or what I hear from other people who aren't lawyers. Um, Even if I knew somebody who was a lawyer or who was practicing in the legal field, I was still processing what they were saying to me through those other ways of thinking. So, just to kind of get started, your ideology or your way of explaining the law, your story about the law, is based on your material conditions, like where you live, what neighborhood you grew up in, kind of what your job is, how much money you have, right? That kind of will tell you a different perspective of the law. Also, your social relations, right? What group do you see yourself in? Are you a religious person? Do you perceive yourself to have power, or are you powerless? How do you see your role as a resident or a citizen, or kind of go on and on and on with these social relations, which you all are kind of in the same boat if you think about it from the point of view of student, right? So how you're going to see the story of the law is going to be very different than if you're a professor or a practitioner of law. So just to kind of understand that is just, it's not a bad thing. It's just a difference. And then finally, your mental models, or how you explain the processes that you see in the world. So this is a complicated and dynamic process. This is not like studying an enzyme in your biology class. It's not studying what would be the appropriate uniform to wear in a corrections facility. This is not like writing a quote unquote standard English sentence, as opposed to, say, African American English, or other code meshing kind of strategies where you can pull in multiple language bases. This is, more of almost like if you thought about it in like a religious sense, right? We're trying to understand something that most people say they believe in, but they haven't had much actual practical experience with. So just try to keep that in mind as we go through this brief explanation. So the main problem or the main difficulty in getting to what would be like a expert understanding of law or a educated story of law. And I might say at this point, right, there are a bunch of students that are at John Jay right now who started where you are and now have complicated and have a more dynamic idea of what the law is. largely by practicing this and then being exposed to that again in future classes. Many of those students reach back to me because they are now working in different career paths where this is necessary information. So I just want to start with kind of the three big primary basic understandings of law that I'll say right off the bat. They're not wrong, right? These are not, I'm not saying this is scientifically incorrect, but they're too simplistic for the study of law to explain how law is used, misused, how it's resisted, kind of, et cetera. Especially when you think about change. And social groups are always trying to make change, even when they have power. They're still trying to change to get more power. So there's unequal power relations, and that's why these simplistic answers don't work. They don't add up. They're not proven in the field, and they're too idealistic most of the time. So the first one is when people refer to law as a possession. In class, we start off at the beginning of the semester, and I kind of poke fun at this. So I show a clip of He-Man. He says he's the master of the universe, and the sword comes out of the sky, and he's got the tool, right? He's got the power. The problem, of course, right? That's not real. Like, I could sit here and say, come to me, law. I could do a potion. I could do a magic spell, but law is never going to actually come to me, right? So it's not a possession. It's not like picking up a guitar. It's not a gun, right? It's not a frying pan, right? It's not an actual object. So the way people misuse this is they say something like this. They say, well, cops have, right? They possess power to enforce the law. There's so many things wrong with this statement, right? If you talk to police officers and you ask them, tell me specifically what your powers are, they have a list of policies and procedures. And they'll actually start asking you some questions. Well, what do you mean? What's the context? So for example, a police officer friend of mine the other day asked me a very complicated legal question. If he catches someone breaking into a garage, but then the person who owns the garage says that, no, it's okay, I don't want the person to be in trouble, can he arrest and charge the person? It's very complicated, right? So when someone says, well, the cops have the power to enforce the law, as a lawyer, I would say, well, what was the law that was broken? Many of you are saying is breaking and entering. Well, you can't break and enter into some place that somebody doesn't care whether you break and enter into. So if there's a dumpster in the middle of the road and you break and enter into it, but then the person who owns it says, no, it's okay, that's not breaking and entering. So the police officer, doesn't have a tool, doesn't have a possession where he or she can just know exactly all the time what the legal process is going to be. So we can't talk about law as a possession. It's never going to hold up that way in court. Cops can believe they have that possession. People can believe that cops have that possession. That might be a fact, right? That's not wrong. But when you start getting into the legal issues, or when you get into court, or you start talking about the Constitution, that's not even going to be a thing. That's not even a relevant element to think about. So the other mistake people do oftentimes is law is abstract. It's transcending. So it's almost like the opposite of a possession, right? At least when we're talking about a possession, you think about it like here on earth. But too often, right, people say things like, well, law should be equal for everyone. And if that doesn't happen, well, it's injustice. Well, again, like that's such an obvious statement, right? But it's like saying something like, well, if I'm not dead, I'm alive. Sure, right? But what does that mean? And so the idea that law is just so far abstract, or it's so far out of this world, not connected to kind of any reality, the kind of the phrase I would use, it's a platitude, right? Pick yourself up and try again. Like, those things don't mean anything, right? And so that's another big problem. So a lot of times people say, these very big ideals about law, or even sadly, one of the things you learned is incorrect. Oftentimes in Intro to Criminal Justice, a textbook will say, well, law are social agreed upon norms, or society agreed upon norms. Society isn't a thing. It's too abstract, right? That's transcendental. That doesn't even, which group are you talking about? Agreed upon, what was the process for being agreed, who was invited, who was excluded, and the norms is even worse, right? That's another abstraction. So, the problem is that's not what law is. When you get into a courtroom, when you're thinking about research, or you're thinking about real concrete situations, it doesn't apply again. So it doesn't work as an answer. And then finally, the one that's hardest, really, I think, for students, if you've watched a lot of TV, because this is exactly how those shows, they always present crime as a choice, right? This person had a choice as to whether they're going to make a crime, and that makes a good show. In fact, there's books about how to write TV shows, and that's one of them. You make it a choice. The problem is that, a racist made a choice to use law against someone. Well, yes and no, right? Again, it's probably true, right? But the problem is that, well, did the racist stop, reflect, think about the situation, say, I have three choices here. I can use law, I can use religion, or I can use blackmail, right? Probably not, right? They're so wrapped up in their world that law just became one of the things that was presently available to them, and they might not even have been thinking about law. So, choice is a very complicated concept within brain studies, cognitive studies, and sometimes I think in like psychology textbooks gets way too limited and way too simple. When you start talking to psychology professors or psychologists in the field, they'll say, of course, choice is very complicated, right? The concept of free will, very complicated. So again, it's not that these aren't, these are perfectly acceptable answers in TV, in your neighborhood, right? When you're just having casual conversations. But as far as like the study of law or the practice of law, as we would say, these don't hold up in court. So one way just to kind of make this a little bit easier is to think about what are called the three dimensions of law, right? And so over here on the left-hand side, these are all one-dimensional. You're making it seem like there's one cause, one answer, and there's at least three, and they work together. So there's the ideology. What do we believe about law? What is the narrative, or what is the story that you have told yourself, that your family talks about law, that your social group talks about law, that your economic class talks about law, that your national identity talks about law? What is that story? Because it's different for everybody. There's not a universal one story. The second thing is, what do the institutions of law, what are the rules? What are the rules of court? What are the rules of judicial interpretation? How do people think about rules? There's a great article about pickup basketball and how the rules of court are actually the same in the rules at the basketball and pickup basketball, where people start coming up with claims of fairness, of unfairness. They make up rules at the time. So rules, right? That's what the institutional kind of side is. As well as the social relations. Who gets to make the rules? Who gets excluded from making the rules? Who are the rules held against? Who gets away from that? And then finally, instrumental. And that's what most of you are kind of focusing on is, when people, do they sue? Do they get charged the crime? Did they get their rights? Were the procedures followed, right? So of course, you have to look at that, but you can't look at that only. You have to look at all three of those things and what is the relationship. So one kind of example to think about is, to push you forward in this class. One claim that I'm researching right now and writing a book chapter about is that there's a claim by folks that poor people and marginal communities, so Black males, Latinos, lesbian women, undocumented immigrants, that those folks, when they have their rights taken away from them, or they're discriminated against, or they suffer injustice, they choose not to sue. They choose not to file a complaint. They choose not to use the instruments of law. I'm deeply suspicious of this claim, right? I think that it's too simplistic, right? And evidence shows, right? Surveys, qualitative research, and my own just experience working with underrepresented groups is that it's not quite that simple, right? Some folks don't know they can sue when something happens to them. Some people, I know somebody right now, they need to sue, but they've got a lot of family obligations that they have to take care of. They just can't focus on that right now. Other folks would rather keep their job than risk losing it by suing. So they'd rather the injustice continue going on. because it wouldn't be in their financial interest. So they're not choosing not to sue, they're just choosing to be economically secure. So there's a lot of reasons why people might use the courts or might file a complaint. Now, most of you did not talk about filing a complaint, bringing a crime. I think only one of you actually wanted to charge the officer with a crime. So you might think about that. Why didn't you talk more about exercising your rights? Most of you talked about the legislature, about other people should have solved the problem. So that's kind of one direction we're trying to go, is thinking about, like, when do people use their rights? When do people think of the law as a tool to make change in a power situation? So this is kind of like, I just took some excerpts, just some sentences out from some of your answers, just to show you. And again, these are representative, right? So I could have done this. I could have pulled out answers from 4 years ago and they'd be almost identical, right? That's how much influence, by the way, media has on people. So what you're seeing in the news, what you're seeing in TV shows, what you hear about, in your everyday experiences, that always comes into the classroom. So I just want to show you, this is kind of the wide variety. There's a wide variety. And in a later presentation, I'll show you, you all saw the injustices very differently. I think it's beautiful. I think it's wonderful that you're able to see that level. I think most of you did a really good job on identifying the injustice, which is where I'd hope you'd be at this point in the semester. So what I want to do now is help you see, how can you now form your judicial opinion and the remaining assignments in the final exam to make sure that you really turn the corner and make this change. So the simplistic answers, for those of you who got kind of the 5 points to 10 point range, right? You started strong. You got the injustice, but you said identity develops over time, and if fixed, there would be little to argue about. Again, I think in a sociology class, that's probably like a B or maybe an A- answer. And I don't disagree with that. But the problem is that even if you see your identity, right? Let's say it takes 15 years and you finally, came to an identity that you're proud of and you defined. The court system, police officers, and other structures of law, they're not going to respect your definition of your identity. It's going to be based on their perspective. And those of you who quoted to the behavioral theory of organizations, this is what you really understood, that those kind of stereotypes, labeling, and those processes are really shaped by where you work, what your family is like, your religious upbringing, etc., right? That those are the things that really help form those ideas about what identity is and what it is not. And similar to that is this idea of, like, why can't the Constitution just mean what it says? Well, the problem is what does it say? Each of you interpreted the Constitution differently. Does it mean the same thing as 1776? No, of course not. And how could it, right? We don't speak that way anymore. None of us were there. We didn't get educated in those things. They didn't have TV. They didn't, so all of these things are unclear. And Tony was denied a right based on racism. Now, maybe, right? But it's too simplistic of an answer for the reasons I went through before. So these are likely true statements. It's not that they're wrong, right? These are not incorrect things. And I kind of agree with all three of them. But they only reveal one dimension of the law. And that means it's unsupported as a causal claim. I can't say that that's a cause of the discrimination. I can say it's a factor. It's an element. It's like 1/3. But there's 2/3 that you're totally ignoring. And so I can't give you an A answer until you address those two other topics. So moving up, again, people got like the one dimension here, but then they went abstract. So in our society, what's society, right? You and I don't live in the same society. We don't run in the same social groups. We don't have the same benefits and privileges. So to say the social class has different rights and opportunities, that creates the injustice and separation. You're good, right? At the idea of, like, yes, different classes, different groups, different power relations have different rights and opportunities. But that's not what creates the injustice. The humans are the ones that created those different classes and those different groups. So at the very least, right, you got to stay within the humans are the ones that are creating those structures. And then, the Constitution was created as a guide to its inhabitants. You know, the Constitution doesn't have any inhabitants, right? So it's a nice ideal, but the Constitution does not create a country. The Constitution does not create a people. It's a document that's basically a contract amongst the people who wrote it. It is unfortunately something we're born into, and is very difficult to renegotiate, although it need not be. So again, these are slightly more legal. They're getting closer to these kind of ideas of rights in the Constitution as actual things that people can argue about. But then they get transcendental. They get abstract. They're not here on Earth, right? They are these kind of platitudes that don't talk about real people who have interests and causes. So it's just a slight. It's just starting to get to the social relations. So it's not just one, right? So it's like kind of 1.5 dimensions here. And that's why it's a handful of points. The next group is like really close, right? 15 to 17, you're really almost there. And I'd say even like, some of the 12 answers, it was hard, right? 12 to 15, you're kind of right in between. And hopefully in your judicial opinion, you'll just get a little bit more concrete, a little bit here in material reality, the actual world, like show how real human beings are using interpretation to harm other people. Not that that's some sociological, abstraction. So things like this, requesting that our legislators actualize approaches and procedures. Well, right. Why would they do that tomorrow if they haven't done it yesterday or for the last 400 years? So again, you just shifted the legal instrument, right? The legal strategy. You seem to understand the ideology. You seem to understand the institution. But then on the instrument, you gave that power away. So rather than it be, Kame's family or Tony's family, right? You just said, well, there's some third party is going to deal with this. To be blunt, it's this next one. Not legally born in the country is an example of racial injustice. Racial injustice is particular to dark-skinned people in the law, right? In fact, you have to make that argument to even win on an equal protection claim based on race. So being born in another country could fall into the sociological category of race, but it is not a legal racial injustice. So again, I don't disagree with the fact. I just can't give you credit because it's a legal class, not a sociology class, not a criminal justice class. So basically, what should you have said, right? So that's a bias based on national origin or culture, right? And so the problem there is you'd have to establish, which is not in the facts, that these people were seeing each other differently by culture. The statements are vague enough where you can't prove that. And that, of course, is intentional. So what should you have said? Well, you should have said, right, like, what is the culture of NYPD, right? What is the culture of higher education or Kingsborough Community College? What is the culture of the specific institution, and how does that lead to the ideology? That will limit what instruments of law or instruments of power you have. So, for example, if you're a white heterosexual male who's a police officer, that is the predominant majority culture within NYPD, higher education, Wall Street. So you have a lot of choices. You have a lot of tools you can use. And in those surveys, when white male heterosexuals have an injustice, they instinctively argue that they're going to sue or use the threat of violence. On the other hand, women in particular in the workplace who still statistically get paid less than men do not go sue in order to get equal pay. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? So the instruments of power or the instruments of law are not the same in these specific institutions, right? So that's where it gets complicated in this class, because we're talking about court, we're talking about within the police department or within the education. The institution has its own set of rules, and so law is not always the thing that people go to. So I just want to like, show this, like what you're trying to get to now is this next example is so close, right? So for people of color to be free, white people have to give up power. Now, I'm pretty sure I said this. And I was, to this student, I think I'm amazed, right? And I'm happy that you understood this idea when we were talking. So just to help everybody else, this is really getting at the social relations, right? So if white people have power over people of color, the only way for that relationship to change, right? And there's lots of literature on this, and lots of civil rights folks and lots of Black philosophers have made this comment, right? Power has to be demanded, right? Change has to be insisted upon. So here we're moving towards the structures that benefit discrimination. In other words, lots of white people aren't going to give up their power because they benefit from that power. They benefit from the unequal relationship. Heterosexual men are not going to give up their power willingly because they benefit from that domination over non-heterosexual women and heterosexual women, and homosexual men and transgendered folks, right? So the structure there, the social relation is the thing that provides benefits to people, and that's the difficulty, right? Because you have like 52 people all want these benefits, and like 7 want to make the change. Well, that's not a good environment to make change. You're going to have to do a lot of consciousness raising, a lot of persuading in order for people to actually believe that they're going to be able to make the change. And somebody's going to have to take that first step. So these answers are still holding on to the idea that law and change are out there somewhere, not within the facts of the hypothetical, not with the people who experience injustice, right? So the kind of the lesson here is the people who are suffering injustice have to be the ones who use law as a tool to make change. They have to do it. And that's what's going to change the benefits and costs, right, for the people who are putting forth the injustice, including those organizations. So NYPD is not going to change unless people force them to change. I almost said a bad word, but bad professors are not going to change unless students force them to change. So the A answers are the ones that really were able to see this through the readings, right? And those readings I provide you are all structural readings. They provide explanations of how you can change the environment, how you can change the structure of the room, how you can, and think about that like quite literally, right? I have no ability to change the structure of the class right now. So the unequal power is just persistent, right? So what am I doing? I'm trying to make videos like this to help explain. I'm offering at any time, right? We can have a Zoom conversation, whatever I can do to kind of equalize those power relations. But we have to understand, in the institution of the internet, access is an issue. Whether you're working is an issue. Whether you have a space to even do your work quietly is an issue. I happen to be helping out with my family during this time, and it's a lot harder than it would be when I'm living alone, right? And so I understand for those of you that don't have 20, 25 hours a week to do your homework, right? That's what people recommend. That doesn't seem realistic in this time, not to mention working, sickness, etc., right? So that's what, these external factors are what kind of influence organizations like higher education or the police department or hospitals, etc., or courthouses. So I thought this was, this particular answer was just beautifully stated, right? So once she witnessed Michael stand up for himself, her motivations and her behavior shifted. And that's how law as an ideology, right? Michael took his privilege, he took his power, and understood his rights and activated them. That then sparked, other people in the room to say, oh, we have rights. And when they decided to come together, that's what will change an organization or an institution. So another student said, I learned that people need a clear field to make rational decisions. This is exactly right. Now, making a clear field or due process or equal opportunity means that we all have to participate. And here I'm talking about we all in this class, right? Not we all in the world, but we all in this class. We'd have to participate. Let's say we wanted to go to the courthouse and we wanted to create a clear field for judges and lawyers to make rational decisions. We'd all have to go create that. It is not created equal right now. In other words, things are not created equal by people. And even in the Declaration of Independence, you'll go back and read, we were created equal by nature's God, not by each other, right? So we create unequal power situations. So in those unequal power situations, it's impossible to make rational decisions. You're going to make decisions based on survival, based on interpretation, based on perceptions, and that will maintain unequal power structures. So these learners recognized how law can spark, right? Law can be used as a tool by social groups in order to make social change with others to reshape the world of law, the story of law, and that's what changes the power relations. Now, if you're super interested in everything I've talked about, you might pick up a book or just go online and see if you can find, the Cliff Notes or an explanation of it, of Whigs and Hunters that goes back to, before this American kind of concept, where you see this in Britain, where everyday folks, stand up to the king of England and demand that they have the ancient right, the 2,000-year-old right, to hunt for deer, right? And so, but this wasn't one person, right? This isn't one person leading the charge, like we often hear the myth of the civil rights movement. This was a bunch of people said, they started talking and saying, this isn't right that this person is getting arrested for something that, generation after generation after generation has done this. So we have rights. Now, clearly, the king didn't think they had rights. So official law or official rights didn't recognize them. But they had a different worldview. They said, no, these rights are inalienable. They're human rights. They're rights that everybody should have. The right to be able to survive, to eat, to defend yourself, right? I don't need the king. I don't need the government. I don't need NYPD to tell me about these things. These are obvious. These are self-evident, as the Declaration of Independence says. So that's how law can be used. But again, it's influenced by those three factors: the institutions of law, the ideologies of law, and the instruments of law. So that's where I have to say, when you watch those TV shows, they're looking at one dimension because, look, there's only 30 minutes and at best there's an hour. They're never going to get through the three dimensions of law in a single. Although, maybe I'll try to write a show, someday and see if it's possible. So again, try to keep in perspective. This is not a major part of your grade. Some of you took it as like a clear sign that you need to study differently, and that's okay, and we can talk. And I'll keep sharing information and go a little bit deeper into these answers to help you out. Especially like based on your injustice groups, right? Because you're all going to kind of understand the law differently. But you will want to start understanding that legal reasoning is much more complicated than a lot of your other classes. And that's not to say anything bad about your classes. It's just this class is particularly complicated and unusual to be taught at a community college. So that's why I want to work with you on this. So I would just try to avoid these common mistakes in the rest of your work, especially on the judicial opinion. Don't talk so much about the hypothetical facts. I mean, some of you wrote 80% of your answer just restating the facts. So this is not English class, right? It's not a history class. I'm not grading you on reading comprehension. I assume, and most of you, it was clear that you understood this and were able to read very deeply into it. I mean, the overwhelming number of you had no problem with the legal facts. So I don't need you to restate all those. If you feel like there's a certain statement in there, like the one where the student restated what happened with Michael, and some of you, restated some things that happened with Tony, and Kamei especially. A lot of you, right, talked about Kamei. But that would be like a sentence, right? And that would only apply to like your argument. It's not, don't spend, 3 paragraphs writing about that. Some of you didn't apply the readings correctly. And I have to be honest, for most of you that did this, you applied them incorrectly. You tried to apply like 3 readings to your answer. So don't, more is not better. take one of the readings and apply it. Take the one that works best for you. Don't try to show me that you understand everything that you learned, because oftentimes maybe you didn't. And I think a lot of you, the one that seems to be giving people the most trouble is originalism, the lesser evil. I want to be clear on that reading. He's saying basically, I mean, you have to understand, right? At the writing of the Constitution, English, privileged heterosexual males who had acquired land illegally by taking it from other people were the only ones who had any rights as interpreted by the original and originalist interpretation of the Constitution. So they believe in a slave-based republic in the same way that Plato wrote about in the Republic. They believe that you and I need to give up our rights to a representative because we don't have the skill set to be leaders of our own country or our own social group. So if you quote to Scalia and originalism as a reason to remedy an injustice, you're immediately incorrect. So you really need to see that reading in relationship to Scott versus Sanford. So up until the 14th, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the majority population viewed the Constitution in an originalist perspective. After that is when you get multiple points of view. And so that's just an example of not applying the reading correctly. And again, in class, we would have gone over this numerous times, and you would hear arguments from other students, and it would sink in a lot easier. This is much harder. And again, you didn't get punished severely on this midterm. It's very minimal impact on your grade. Many of you failed to, those of you who focus on the criminal side, you failed to include the emergency exceptions to police powers. So given the situation that was going on outside, arguments for due process, probable cause, they all would have been covered by the exigent circumstances exceptions. So Miranda doesn't apply. I don't think anybody quoted Terry versus Ohio, but that doesn't apply. I forget the other case that somebody cited to. It'll come back to me. I can almost see it in my head. So I liked your arguments. I mean, you tried really hard, right? And I think they're still good arguments, right? But if you're going to focus on that side of it, you got to be careful. After the Patriot Act, police have a lot of discretion. And I'm not going to rule on the hypo because you still have some more work to do on it. But if you're going to keep making that argument, you need to have at least a balancing approach. You can't say conclusively that the police couldn't have done what they did in that case. You're going to have to make an argument. You can't just say, well, the Sixth Amendment says this, so they have to have that. It's not clear. You have to make your argument and try to see it from the side of the police and what argument they're going to make. And then I would avoid the isms, right? Racism does not cause something, right? Racism is a description of a system of unequal power. Same thing with sexism, right? These things don't cause things. These are language we use to describe things that cause things. So focus on the structure, which is the social relations, who has power, who doesn't, what are the rules of the institution, etc. Or just think about it as a factor. So you could see something like this racist individual abused their power when they did X, Y, and Z. But don't just say racism is why they abused their power. So the grading rubric, again, is here. I applied this a few times, but I just now kind of explained to you, how you can move up the chain to get an A here. And the goal here is you'll want to have a balance. You want to show like the ideal of law, the ideal of equality is one thing, and that's one story that people tell about the law. But in reality, people experience injustice. Then you want to try to quote to these cases that kind of back that up. And that's the next part. You have to do your own legal research now and find these legal principles in cases, laws, rights documents, etc. So to improve your grade, right? Some of you have asked that already. Do your best on this judicial opinion. It's going to be, either 30 or 15 points. That's it. You turn it in on time, you're going to get either 30 or 15 points. So if you follow directions exactly, you cite to one of the sources that I provided to you on the website and in Blackboard, you correctly apply the evidence from your research to the legal rule that you make up, what you believe is the right legal rule. And then if your conclusion is logical, right, it connects to each of those things, you're going to get 30 points. If you don't do those things, right, if you don't follow the directions, and many of you struggled to follow the directions on the midterm, if you do not cite to an appropriate legal source, Wikipedia would not be an appropriate legal source. A documentary would not be an appropriate legal source. Your Uncle Bob would not be an appropriate legal source, right? I gave you the examples that you need to be looking for. That's what I'm going to focus mostly on to give you 15 points. If you incorrectly or unclearly apply the perceived evidence to your legal rule, I'm going to be very soft on that. I'm going to try to see it from your point of view, and you would have to clearly deviate, right? The evidence would have to be totally mismatched with the rule that you're trying to make up. Based on how many, based on your answers so far, I don't think this is going to be a big problem. You should still try hard on this part, but I'm not too worried about that based on your answers so far. You're progressing that way. I think you'll be able to make that connection. And I think if you've taken, some of the other criminal justice classes, you're pretty good at this part of taking evidence and applying it to your legal rule. Your conclusion does not logically connect to the injustice rule research evidence. In other words, this one, I want to be clear about this. A lot of people, you need to have a remedy. You need to have some punishment, or you need to, a lot of you didn't do that in your midterm. So now's the time to say, what's supposed to happen in this case? Now this terrible thing has happened. There's been an injustice. You think it was wrong. You found a legal rule, you found a case, you found a law, or you found a rights document. So what's going to happen? What's the punishment? What should be the compensation, right? What's the conclusion here? That's what judges do, right? They resolve a conflict. So if you don't do that, right, I can't give you the 30 points. So you got to have something, right? You got to have some kind of a resolution. And then last, it's not a joke, right? When I give you a template, I'm trying to do you a favor. I'm trying to make it as easy for you as possible, right? So you have 3 pages. So I clearly tell you how to do this, right? Pick one of the characters above and describe the legal facts of their injustice in 1 paragraph. Don't pick 3. Don't pick 5. Don't tell me there's a lot of injustices. I know, I wrote it. Pick one and stick with that person and just get right to the point. Don't spend a bunch of time, right? Just say, this is what I think happened to this person in 1 paragraph, right? 3 to 4 sentences, short sentences. I know the fact pattern. I know you know the fact pattern. This is just to help with the rest of the document so that we know, what you're talking about. Then write the legal rule you think was violated in 1 to 2 sentences. Now, I'll tell you, some of you already did this, okay? You can change that if you didn't like your midterm answer, you forgot, or you forgot to keep a copy. Do not email me and ask me to send it to you. That would take forever. Restate the legal rule. Say what you think was violated and very briefly, get right to the point. And then here are the sources again that you need to cite to. This is 2 to 3 paragraphs. Say it again. This is 2 to 3 paragraphs. Just explain what you found from your research and how it applies to your rule and how it applies to the injustice. Okay, 2 to 3 paragraphs. To cite to it, you can either give me the URL, which is the web address. Okay, you can do that as a footnote. You can do it as a parenthetical. I don't care. Or, you want to be fancy and you want to do the APA style or the Chicago style, go for it. So give me the title, date, and the author. You should be looking at Google Scholar, the Cornell Legal Information Institute, state or federal laws, the United States Constitution. And again, some of you already did this. So by all means, right, use that again. And then finally, this is where the heart of your work is going to be for the rest of the semester. Make the connection, right? Start to show how this applies, right? You get to be the decision maker. So how does this work that you did apply to your conclusion, what you think should happen, what's the resolution to the conflict, and make sure you're talking about real human beings, right? Not society, not entire organizations, right? Be specific. Who should be punished? And if you can imagine other people that should be punished, then just give the titles, right? What would be their titles within the organization? Try to remember that the professor, if you thought that they broke the rule, remember they work for the city of New York, right? They work for, it could be the president should get involved. And by the way, that particular example, I know many professors who have made that comment in the last 6 months. So, that's a real, all of these things are based on a true story, right? Are based on real events. So they're just put together. I mean, I've never heard of anything being that bad all together at once. So I just took separate stories and put them into one. And that idea there is that you just have to pick one, right? Injustices happen all the time. You pick one and you stay with it. So try to be specific with who the people are and what the specific resolution should be. That will get you 30 points without too much trouble. I think if you say, okay, I totally get it now. I see what I was doing, how I was incomplete in my answer on the midterm. I'm going to totally get an A on this next part. Remember, this is worth more than the midterm. So this plus, the assignments you've done so far, plus the extra credit, you're at an A, and all you have to do is keep that up for the rest of the assignments. So I think that you'll be okay. Just make sure you watch this, maybe watch it more than once, go back to the other videos, watch them, right? This is the best thing we can do. And then I'm still going to keep offering. Very few people take it up, just like in office hours. But let me know. We can Zoom. I can talk to you one-on-one. So far for the students I've talked to, this works really well. It's okay with me if you don't put your camera on. It's okay with me if your family's in the background. I like to say hi. We can talk with them too. It's okay if you talk to me in your car. It's okay if, you sneak away from work. I don't want you to get fired, right? But it's okay. I will talk to you in any environment. So don't be afraid to talk to me. This is the best we can do in this environment. So please, please, please take me up on it. I think that's all I can say on this.